I used to believe that age brought protection, that after 60 years of living, working, surviving heartbreaks and disappointments, I had already faced the hardest lessons life could throw at me. I believed wisdom would shield me from betrayal. I was wrong. My name is Margaret Lane. I am 62 years old. And I thought I knew what it meant to be rich, not just in money, but in friendship, trust, and loyalty. For decades, my best friend Clara Bennett was my confidant, my sister in everything except blood. She was there when I buried my husband. She was there when I built my business from nothing into a fortune worth tens of millions. She knew my secrets, my fears, my victories. I trusted her with everything, and that, I now realize, was my greatest mistake. Because one evening, when the papers were signed, the accounts drained, and the contracts locked, I discovered that Clara Bennett, the woman who toasted every one of my birthdays, who cried with me in the pew at my husband's funeral, who swore she'd stand beside me no matter what, had stolen everything I had. But what she didn't understand was that at 62, I was not a woman waiting to fade quietly into the shadows. I was a woman who had built her empire once before, with nothing but grit, intuition, and determination. And I was prepared to build again, even stronger, even smarter. She thought betrayal would break me, but it only awakened the fire inside me that I had forgotten still burned when I first suspected something was wrong. It was just a whisper of unease. Clara had started taking calls in the next room when we met for lunch. She had begun asking strangely specific questions about my accounts, about my estate, about how I planned to distribute things after I was gone. I brushed it off as concern from a friend who worried about my age. But beneath that, something darker was moving. And I ignored the instinct that told me so. The truth came crashing into my life the day I received a call from my attorney. "Margaret, I need to confirm, did you authorize the transfer of $4 million to an offshore account last week?" My blood ran cold. I hadn't, but someone with access had. And the signature on the authorization was flawless. My signature, forged. The shock was like a second widowhood. Money, you see, isn't just numbers in a bank for me. It is survival. It is independence. It is the proof that I could stand on my own after losing my husband. That I could build a future when everyone expected me to crumble. To see it vanish in someone else's hands was like watching my life's meaning dissolve. At first, I wanted to believe it was a mistake. Maybe a hacker. Maybe a confused clerk. But when the investigators traced the transfer trail, when the emails and phone records surfaced, one name kept appearing. Clara Bennett. My best friend. My betrayer. I cannot describe the sickness that gripped me when I heard her name confirmed. It was like someone reached inside my chest and twisted. Memories of her holding my hand through every storm clashed with the image of her typing instructions to drain my accounts. I wept until I thought I'd collapse. But then the tears hardened into something else. Rage, I decided. I would not be her victim. What Clara didn't know was that I had prepared for storms like this. Years of business had taught me to keep safeguards, backup accounts, shadow investments, a private lawyer who managed a trust Clara never knew about. She thought she had stolen everything, but in reality, she had stolen the bait I left in plain sight. My true fortune remained hidden, untouchable. That was my first victory. But my second victory would not just be protecting my wealth. It would be reclaiming my dignity and building something Clara could never touch. She had stolen the facade, but she could never steal the foundation of who I was. I began again. At 62 years old, I walked into the same world that underestimated me after my husband died. Rivals laughed at me then, too. They whispered, "She's too old, too fragile, too dependent." Clara thought the same, but I knew better. I knew wisdom is sharper than youth. And scars teach lessons that betrayals cannot erase. I started small investments Clara knew nothing about. Partnerships she never dreamed I could build. I worked late into the night, fueled not by greed, but by the desire to prove to myself, to her, to the world, that I was not done. I was not finished. And every move I made, every deal I signed, was one step toward something Clara could never steal from me again. But then, just when I thought I had left her behind, Clara reappeared. Not as a friend, not as a rival, but as something worse, an enemy who had underestimated the wrong woman. Because while she celebrated her theft, while she lived off what she thought was my fortune, the walls around her were already closing in. You see? What Clara didn't realize is that betrayal leaves a trail, and I was following it step by step until the day came when I would face her again. And that confrontation, that revelation, would change everything. I thought betrayal had already stripped me bare. But my story began when I realized Clara wasn't content with simply stealing my money. She wanted my name, my reputation, my life's work. She wanted to erase me entirely. When word spread that Margaret Lane, the so-called Grand Dame of Riverford Estates, had been swindled, the vultures circled. Competitors whispered in country club corners. Newspapers printed rumors that I had gone senile, that I had lost everything. And you know who fed those rumors? Clara, my friend of 40 years. The woman who once braided my hair before job interviews, who promised to be my family after my husband died. She was the one spreading lies that I was finished. But here's the truth Clara didn't know. I welcomed the whispers, because while they laughed, I was working. I still had my secret accounts, carefully hidden investments that had tripled quietly over the years. I still had property in my maiden name, and a lawyer who owed me his loyalty after I once saved his daughter from bankruptcy. And most importantly, I had time. Clara thought 62 meant weakness, but 62 meant I had already lived through losses that would have destroyed anyone else. Death, poverty, betrayal. I had endured all three and still stood. I began to build again in silence. I moved my meetings to my home, away from prying eyes. I forged partnerships with people Clara had dismissed as too small to matter. I invested in technology startups, in renewable energy firms, in young, hungry entrepreneurs who saw me not as an old woman, but as a lifeline. They didn't care about Clara's whispers. They only cared that my checks cleared and my advice rang true. Slowly, my foundation grew. Slowly, I began to weave a safety net that would catch me if I fell again. But Clara wasn't finished. One morning, I woke to a knock on the door. A delivery man handed me a thick envelope stamped with a county court seal. Inside, neatly typed and coldly worded, was a lawsuit. Clara Bennett was suing me for fraud, for breach of contract, for theft of assets she herself had stolen. The audacity was breathtaking. She had drained my accounts, forged my signature, and now she was parading into court claiming I had wronged her. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. But mostly, I wanted to fight. My attorney, Richard Hayes, sat across from me in his oak-paneled office, his expression grim. "Margaret, she has money to drag this out. If we don't settle, this could last years." "Then let it," I told him. "Let it last as long as it takes. Because I won't pay a dime to a thief who dares call herself my friend." But inside, I trembled. Court battles aren't fought with emotions, they're fought with evidence. And Clara had stolen so much that, on paper, almost looked like I was the guilty one. I began to understand that this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about identity. If Clara won, she wouldn't just have my fortune. She would take my good name, my credibility, the respect I had spent decades earning. She wanted to destroy me from the inside out. So I made a choice. I would stop hiding. I would take the whispers, the humiliation, the stares of pity, and I would turn them into fuel. I went back to places I had avoided. The charity luncheons, the investment clubs, the board meetings. I walked in wearing my pearls, my tailored suits, my head high, even when I knew people were muttering about me. And when they whispered, I smiled, because they had no idea that beneath their mockery, I was already rebuilding something bigger than Clara could ever steal. It was during one of these meetings that I met Eva Morales, a young tech CEO with eyes that burned with ambition. She had heard the rumors about me, but instead of pity, she offered me a hand. "I think you know what it's like to build something when no one believes in you," she said. And in her words, I recognized myself 30 years ago. Together, Ava and I launched a venture fund for women over 50. We called it Phoenix Rising. It was bold, it was daring, and it terrified Clara, because while she was clinging to stolen money, I was building a legacy. And yet, the deeper I climbed, the more dangerous Clara became. She began showing up at events uninvited, her laughter ringing a little too loud, her eyes flashing with false innocence. "Oh, Margaret, darling, so good to see you," she would say, her hands squeezing mine with just enough pressure to remind me of what she had taken. She whispered in ears, sowing seeds of doubt. "She's not what she seems. She's losing her mind. She doesn't know what she's doing anymore." But every time she did, I reminded myself she was playing a short game, and I was playing the long one. One night, exhausted from the weight of it all, I found myself sitting in the study of my home, staring at the portrait of my late husband. "What would you do, Robert?" I whispered. "How do I beat her without becoming her?" And then it struck me. The way to beat Clara wasn't to fight her on her terms. It was to create something so unshakable, so undeniable, that even if she screamed her lies from the rooftops, no one would believe her. I didn't need revenge. I needed renewal. But still, revenge tempted me, because beneath my dignity, beneath my resolve, was a heart that still ached for the woman I once called my sister. I wanted her to feel what I felt when I discovered her betrayal. I wanted her to look around one day and realize she had burned the only bridge that ever truly mattered. I didn't know then that opportunity would come sooner than I imagined. Because Clara, drunk on arrogance, would make a mistake so colossal it would hand me the weapon. I needed to bring her down once and for all. And when that moment came, I would be ready. They say arrogance blinds you faster than grief ever could. And Clara Bennett was proof. The more I rebuilt my life in silence, the louder she became. She couldn't stand that I wasn't crawling back to her begging for scraps. She wanted me broken, humiliated. But what she didn't know was that her need for control would become her undoing. It began at a gala, the kind of glittering affair where chandeliers sparkle above champagne flutes, and everyone pretends their laughter isn't laced with rivalry. Clara arrived late in a gown that shimmered like stolen gold. Her arm looped through the elbow of a younger man she introduced as her financial partner. I knew him instantly. Matthew Reynolds, 28, fresh MBA, once an intern in my firm. Hungry but careless. The kind of man who thought connections mattered more than competence. She paraded him through the room, whispering, pointing, smirking. But what struck me most wasn't the spectacle, it was the paper she pulled from her handbag during the auction contracts. Actual contracts. And in her tipsy arrogance, she showed them off. She was boasting about acquisitions she hadn't finalized, deals not yet announced, signatures she didn't legally hold. I said nothing. But inside, something clicked. Clara had overplayed her hand. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, I slipped away to the balcony for air. The city below sparkled, indifferent to my private war. And then a voice behind me said, "She's breaking laws she doesn't even understand." It was Ava, the young CEO who had become both ally and anchor. She had noticed too. Clara's arrogance wasn't just social, it was financial. She was manipulating numbers, forging signatures, gambling with other people's futures. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't just defend myself against Clara's lies. I would expose the truth. But exposure required patience. Clara was reckless, but she was also cunning. I couldn't simply accuse high. Needed evidence strong enough to make her empire collapse under its own weight. So I watched, I attended her events. I let her accidentally copy me on emails. I listened as she bragged about companies she was taking over, and piece by piece, the puzzle formed. She was inflating her holdings, misrepresenting investors, even funneling funds through shell accounts. She was committing fraud on a scale that made her betrayal of me look like child's play. The cruelest part, she thought she was untouchable. Weeks later, I invited her to tea. It had been months since we had sat face to face. She arrived radiant, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Well, Margaret," she purred, "I suppose you've heard about my latest acquisition. Quite the coup, don't you think?" I stirred my tea slowly. "I have. Impressive. Though it's curious how quickly you've expanded. Some might even say, suspiciously quick." Her smile faltered, just for a second. But then she leaned forward. "You always were jealous, Margaret. Admitted to hate that I outsmarted you. That I took what you were too old and too weak to protect." Her words burned, but I kept my expression cool. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I've simply learned patience. You see, Clara, I don't need to outsmart you. You're already doing the work for me." The color drained from her face. She left soon after, her laughter a little too forced, perfume lingering bitterly in the air. And in that moment, I knew I had rattled her. What followed was chaos. Clara grew desperate. She launched smear campaigns online, hiring anonymous accounts to call me a fraud, a has-been. She showed up at Phoenix Rising events, trying to discredit me publicly. She even tried to lure Ava away with promises of higher funding. But Ava saw through her. The cracks widened. One evening, Ava burst into my study, breathless. "Margaret, you need to see this." She handed me a folder. Inside were financial statements leaked by none other than Matthew, Clara's young partner. He had grown tired of being her pawn. And in exchange for discretion, he gave us everything. Proof of forged signatures, false filings, illegal transfers. I stared at the documents, my hands trembling. This was it. The weapon. The key to ending her reign. But even as triumph swelled, grief twisted inside me. Because beyond the betrayal and lies, I remembered Clara as she once was, the girl who had cried with me after Robert's funeral, who had danced barefoot in my kitchen when we were 25 and broke. The friend I thought would stand beside me until the end. How had she become this monster? Or had she always been one, hiding behind friendship until it no longer served her? The question haunted me, but I knew the answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what I would do next. Richard, my attorney, studied the files with wide eyes. "Margaret, this isn't just civil fraud. This is criminal. If we take this to the authorities, she won't just lose her fortune, she could go to prison." I sat in silence. The image of Clara in handcuffs flickered in my mind. But so did the memory of her holding my newborn son. Tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "I'll always protect him." Margaret, always. Could I really destroy her completely? The decision weighed heavier than I expected. But as I watched Ava's determination, as I thought of the women counting on Phoenix Rising, as I remembered the countless nights I cried alone while Clara celebrated with my stolen wealth, I realized I didn't owe her mercy. She had chosen this path, and so I began to plan. The final act of my story wasn't going to be a courtroom battle. No, I would let Clara destroy herself with the truth as my ally. All I had to do was pull one thread and her empire would unravel. And when it did, the world would finally see her for what she was. Not a visionary, not a queen, but a thief, and I would rise not for revenge, but for renewal. Still, as I closed the folder that night, one thought kept me awake until dawn. Was I prepared to watch my oldest friend fall so far she could never get back up? Because once I set this plan in motion, there would be no turning back. The weight of choice pressed down on me like a stone. In my hands, I held the power to end Clara Bennett, not just her career, not just her reputation, but her very freedom. The evidence Richard had organized was airtight, forged signatures, fabricated board approvals, investor fraud on a scale that could send her away for decades. And yet, when I stared at her name across those documents, a whisper of doubt still lingered. This was the woman who once braided my hair before my wedding, who held my hand when I thought grief would drown me, who knew every secret I had ever confessed in confidence. But this was also the woman who stole everything I had built, who left me broken when I was most fragile, who smirked as she paraded my life's work as her own. Mercy or justice? Sentiment or survival? I didn't get long to deliberate. Fate decided to push things forward faster than I planned. It began with a call from Ava at sunrise. "Margaret," she said, her voice taut with urgency, "turn on the morning news." I didn't. There she was. Clara, standing in front of flashing cameras, announcing a groundbreaking merger between her company and one of the biggest firms on Wall Street. Her words were bold, her tone commanding. But the problem was obvious to me immediately. She didn't actually have the legal right to announce it. She was bluffing, overreaching, and in that moment, the arrogance that had carried her so far became the very rope she was wrapping around her own neck. I smiled for the first time in weeks. "She's handed us the match," I murmured. By noon, Richard and I were in motion. The evidence packet was quietly delivered to both the Securities and Exchange Commission and the financial press. By 2 o'clock, whispers had already begun to ripple across the market. And by 4, Clara Bennett's empire began to crumble in real time. The stock price plummeted. Investors fled. Reporters swarmed her offices, demanding answers. And Clara, for the first time in decades, looked rattled. The woman who had always walked into rooms with her chin high and her heels clicking suddenly looked small. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I received an email. No subject line, no greeting, just a single line. "You did this." I stared at it for a long time, my chest tightening. She wasn't wrong. But she wasn't right either. Clara had done this to herself. I had only revealed the truth she worked so hard to bury. The next day, the final blow came. Federal agents arrived at her penthouse, armed with warrants. I didn't see her arrest, but I saw the photographs splashed across every news outlet by evening. Clara Bennett, once untouchable, once envied, once feared, was led out in handcuffs. I thought I would feel elation, triumph, vindication, but instead, what I felt was grief. A hollow ache in my chest as I whispered to myself, it didn't have to end this way. For days afterward, I wrestled with conflicting emotions. Relief that justice had been served. Sadness that my dearest friend had become my greatest enemy. And guilt because no matter how I tried to justify it, part of me would always remember the Clara who once sat beside me on quiet nights, dreaming about the future. But slowly, the grief gave way to something else. Renewal. Phoenix rising. The nonprofit I had built from the ashes of my life was flourishing. Women who had once been silenced were finding their voices again. Families who had lost everything were getting second chances. And through it all, Ava stood beside me, reminding me that from betrayal, something beautiful had been born. One evening, after a successful fundraising gala, Ava raised her glass to me and said, "You turned your pain into power, Margaret. And you taught all of us that betrayal doesn't define us, what we do after it does." Her words sank deep into my soul. Because she was right. Clara's betrayal had nearly destroyed me, but it had also forced me to rebuild stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. Months later, I visited the courthouse where Clara's sentencing was held. I didn't have to be there, but something in me needed closure. She stood before the judge, thinner, her eyes shadowed, her arrogance finally stripped away. When she turned her head and our eyes met across the courtroom, a flicker of recognition passed between us. Not hatred, not even regret, just acknowledgement we had once been inseparable. Now we were strangers bound by the same story, but standing on opposite sides of its lesson. As the gavel struck and her sentence was read, I whispered to myself, "Goodbye, Clara," and I walked out into the sunlight, lighter than I had felt in years. That night, I returned home and sat by the fire with a glass of wine. My children called, my grandchildren laughed in the background, and my home was filled with the kind of warmth no amount of betrayal could ever steal. I realized then that wealth, power, even reputation, none of it mattered as much as the strength to keep going when someone tries to break you. And I promised myself, and anyone who would listen, you are never too old, too broken, or too betrayed to rise again, because I had, and I would never fall the same way twice.